Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 21st, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at the election audits for the 2020 election that's being held in Arizona and is being considered in a number of other states, and how the American public responds to such audits. Now, as you can tell from the headline and from the title of this video, the American people are turning on these election audits, which are normally routine immediately after the election. The state of Pennsylvania GOP state senators have been hinting that they might be in and proposing an audit of a similar nature as the one in Arizona, which has been taking place over the past month now. And the reason why this is being brought up is because the Republican legislatures in some of these states have control to make these changes. They have the ability to be in a position where they will ask the county or the state to audit the 2020 election, essentially allowing certain companies and certain groups to count the ballots again to ensure that they were counted correctly, to make sure that there was no tampering of the ballots. Whatever this means, essentially, it's not necessarily a recount per se because it won't change the outcome of the results, but it is an audit. It allows an open discussion as to whether or not the election results were legitimate. But the reason why this is something that the American public might be turning on is just the fact that these are now being brought back up months after the 2020 election. I covered the Arizona Maricopa County audit. Now, if you want an understanding really quickly about why they're choosing Maricopa County, the way Maricopa County goes in Arizona is the way that the state goes as well. In this county, Joe Biden won by 2.2%. He won the state by 0.3%. He was able to win Maricopa County and consequently win the state. He won in Maricopa County by around 40,000 votes, won in Arizona by around 10,000 votes. It's an area in which there are Republican officials. The Republican State Senate was able to subpoena these ballots. They were able to send them over to be counted in convention centers. It went through a very slow process, but they wanted to see what was happening in Maricopa County because on the Republican side, they thought there was some type of election fraud despite no evidence of saying that there was any type of fraud whatsoever. But looking at the Arizona GOP audit, this is something that the Republican Party in Arizona really was just aiming to appease President Trump. This audit knew, the people that were asking for this audit knew that there would be nothing that could come as a result of it, and if anything, it would just confirm yet again that Joe Biden fairly won the state of Arizona. But I think it was a little bit more of a reason than that. There was more of a reason than just to be sure about the election results. I think the Republican Party wants to, at least in Arizona, continue these baseless claims of election fraud and talk about how the 2020 election is still under litigation, even though there is nothing that says that Arizona can be overturned, that President Trump can be reinstated, regardless of what he would like to pretend or send out. Joe Biden will be the president for at least the next 3.5 years. Joe Biden will be serving until 2025 or potentially 2029. It is entirely set out in stone that Joe Biden will be serving out the remainder of this term. So for Donald Trump and the Republican Party to keep continuing discussion about this election is turning the American public against these audits. An audit would be okay immediately after the election, but months after, half a year after, 8 months after, it becomes excessive. And the fact is, the majority of Americans say this is a partisan effort. 57% of Americans say they view that these audits are partisan efforts to undermine valid election results. The election results are already set in stone. 57% means almost all of the Democrats, many independents, and potentially some Republicans. And just 1/3 of them say they are legitimate efforts to identify potential voting irregularities. So with just 1/3 of America on the Republican Party side with these audits, I don't entirely understand why they continue to do them. Because the Republican Party has been clear in some of these states. You have Brad Raffensperger, a Republican in Georgia, saying the election was fair and free. You have a Republican governor, Doug Ducey, in Arizona, saying the election was fair in that state. Joe Biden fairly won the state of Arizona. You have Republicans across the nation, though, that are saying the exact opposite, that Joe Biden stole Arizona, completely disregarding the Republican election officials in that state, that Joe Biden stole Georgia, completely disregarding the Republican election officials in those states. These Republicans are not anti-Trump. You have Brian Kemp and Doug Ducey, both of which who wholeheartedly received that endorsement from President Trump and endorsed him again for the 2020 election, campaigned with him, did everything they could to ensure that he would win, but he immediately turned on the two, all because Joe Biden fairly won those two states. And it really, I think, gets under his skin that Donald Trump lost these states, but he continues to push on the Republican Party to do these audits, and the Republican Party is following through. The Republicans were called out back in 2016 by Hillary Clinton when she said that when Donald Trump loses this election, or if he loses this election, that referring to the 2016 election, which of course we know that Donald Trump did win, if he was to lose essentially, he would call election fraud. Now, President Trump never really dispelled that. When he was asked in the 2020 election the same exact question, he said he needed to see the election results before he made a determination as to whether or not they would be fair. The fact is, Joe Biden did say he would accept the election results. Donald Trump, however, did not. We were watching election night in November of 2020. We remember when Donald Trump came on the television screen or across your media source and said that he had won the election. Joe Biden just said, let's wait for them to count. This isn't a partisan thing. This is not some type of biased statement. I can't make it clearer. The 2020 election was a fair election. And if you don't agree with me, then you're just wrong. Because looking at the election results, there is no way, there is no evidence of any type of election fraud whatsoever, not even to a point where Bill Barr could try to find a single thing across the United States, saying there was no evidence. And I know someone's going to mention the fact that I'm using CNN. They simply are telling you what he said. His quote is that there was no evidence of voter fraud, that there was no substantial claim that could be substantiated by anything that was coming into the Justice Department, anything that was coming in on the statewide level, anything that was coming in that would break the security of our election system. We are so confident in the validity of our elections, and then all of a sudden, President Trump comes around and says the election is rigged, and then we completely break down to a point where, yes, the majority of Americans view these audits as something that is bad, something that is just a partisan effort to undermine the election results, but then you have Pennsylvania Republicans saying, why don't we do the same thing? And when you're looking at the amount of Americans that believe in voter fraud, it's not the majority, but it is 1/3. 1 in 3 Americans believe that the 2020 election was rigged. 1 in 3 Americans, 33% of the population. I'm not really surprised, but I do think that it is something that is quite unfortunate, given that this number was not nearly as high back in 2016 or 2012 or 2008 or 2004. Maybe in the year 2000, that was the last time. But even in 2000, Al Gore conceded the election in December. To this day, Donald Trump has yet to officially release a concession statement. Every time he has acknowledged that he lost the election, he claims it was due to election fraud. The difference is, barely any of the other presidential candidates in United States history have tried to do the same exact tactic, and none in modern American politics, at least notable presidential nominees. Because at least on the part of Al Gore, he gave up the election. For Donald Trump, he hasn't. He's pushing for these audits. He's telling people that there's a possibility of him being reinstated. Every single step of the way, Donald Trump found out that there was no election fraud, but continued these claims. And when he was down by 8 points in November, it only continued to decrease for him, to a point where before the insurrection, he had a 43% approval rating versus 45% on election day, a 53% disapproval rating versus 52%. And then, boom, the Capitol was stormed for the first time in over 200 years, and he leaves office with a 58% disapproval rating and a 39% approval rating. In fact, the disapproval rating number at 57.9% is the highest disapproval rating number for President Trump during the entire time of his presidency, which means he left on the worst note possible on his final day in office. And how does the Republican Party respond to this? It is clear that they want these audits, at least in Arizona. I'm not trying to label every Republican. I don't think that is something that is fair to do, but I do think that these audits are, number one, a waste of money, and number two, they continue to push this claim that the election wasn't legitimate. Arizona was forcibly recounted. It was decided by a margin of 0.5%. President Trump's campaign ensured that the recount effort followed through. There have been audits on the statewide level. The election was certified by the Republican governor. The election was certified by the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. It went to the vice president at the time, Mike Pence, who went on to certify the Arizona results. Yet this audit occurs in May of 2021, literally had to stop because of high school graduations. People had time to start in their first semester of their senior year in high school, myself included, and you don't audit the results, or you did, but continue to audit the results all the way through their graduation. At the same time that Arizona's results were being counted and being recounted in November of 2020, before winter had even hit, they were auditing Arizona while I was walking across the stage. Can you imagine the lapse in time? And that's exactly what it was. You're talking about a difference of 6 months, all for what? The election to be the exact same result. And if this actually does pick up traction in Pennsylvania, I can tell you now, more than just 57% of Republicans of Americans are going to say that these audits aren't valid. More than 57%. Because while the audits at face value seem like something which might reinsure or ensure American trust in the election process, this only makes things seem worse. An audit after the election, A-okay. But for it to be occurring this far out means, at least in the eyes of the average American voter, someone who probably isn't watching my videos, isn't watching or reading these articles closely, the next time they see that there is an audit occurring, sorry about that, the storm is completely out of my control, but next time that they do see an audit, they're going to question, wait a second, maybe the election was rigged. If they're auditing again 6 to 7 to 8 months after the election, what if there's something that they found? What is the reason for this audit? The Republican Party excuse in Arizona that this is something, and in Pennsylvania, as we see here from, we can actually read what the quote was. It says that this is not a bad idea to proceed at all with an audit similar to what they're doing in the state of Arizona. They don't really see the damage in it. You know, looking at this, they say it's something that it's not a bad idea, that maybe it's something that can reassure the American public in the validity of the election results. But the thing is, we already are confident in the election results. Only 1 in 3 Americans say that the election was rigged. That 33% is not going to change by audits they could easily say were rigged or audits that were controlled by the Democratic Party. 33% of Americans is probably a number we are not going to change from. But the reality of the situation is the majority of Americans view these audits as shams. 67% of Americans either have no opinion or believe the election was legitimate, which means that there are more Americans against this big lie, against these claims of election fraud, yet for some reason, some of these Republicans in some of these swing states believe that the winning strategy, or a strategy that can win them over voters in the future, or one that won't backfire on them, are these election audits. But it's very clear and very evident from this data, from these new numbers, that not only does the American public believe the election was legitimate, they also believe that these audits are fraudulent, they are shams, they are partisan efforts to undermine the 2020 election results, directly quoted from the poll itself. And there's a reason why Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, remains popular. There's a reason why the Democratic Party seems to be outperforming the Republicans in the Virginia governor poll, in the New Jersey governor poll, in the generic ballot poll for the 2022 midterm elections. 2022 and potentially 2021 should be referendums against President Biden, the same way 2017 and 2018 were referendums against President Trump. But that isn't going to be the case, at least for right now. Joe Biden needs to be unpopular before a referendum occurs. He needs to be underwater. And while the numbers are narrowing, as he's only approved of by 9.1%, compare that to how President Trump was on this day in office. If you truly want to take a look at 153 days in, Donald Trump had a 38.7% approval rating, an approval rating of just 39%. Today, Joe Biden stands at a 52% approval rating. So Biden seems to be doing better than Trump. Worse than Obama, but just as good as Bush. Better than Clinton, worse than H.W. Bush, worse than Reagan, worse than Carter, but better than Ford, but then worse than Nixon. But you do have to understand that polling data has only gotten more accurate in the 21st century. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. These approval rating polls should be closely tied to those rather than the other former presidents, but it is always interesting to compare. But the main takeaway is these audits are continuing to push Americans away from trusting the election results or continuing them at odds with the election results. Because if you look at this 33% number, you can see in November, this same poll shows that 32% of Americans believed that Biden won by fraud. In January, 32%. In March, 32%. And today, 32%. So not only are these audits potentially adding more people to that 32% number, it seems as if that it's holding a grip on them. The more that they see these audits, the more confirmed they are, and the more reaffirmed they are in their prior belief. And that's the dangerous thing. When you have 1 in 3 Americans, you can go to a street and pick out 3 Americans. Chances are one of them will think that the election was rigged. That is not how American democracy should work. We should be confident in our election results. If Bill Barr can't find any election results any election fraud, there probably isn't any. But it's not just him. It's the Republican legislatures across the United States that couldn't find anything. After holding hearings, testimonies, etc., fueling conspiracy theories, President Trump's legal team, and I say that in quotes for a reason, and you can't see that, but understand they're in air quotes, legal team going to the court system, shot down quite literally 50 times. The Supreme Court won't even consider the case when 1/3 of the entire Supreme Court has been appointed solely by President Trump. Looking at what we know now, with a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and yet 0 of them, maybe 1, Thomas or Alito, listening to this election fraud case, it shows you just how much the public and how little evidence there is of fraud. Because if they can't find anything, if no one can find anything, and the only recorded cases of election fraud and nothing substantial, you're talking about, over 100 million votes in this election, over 150 million votes. I believe the only 2 cases were found were from Pennsylvania, but they were 2 Republicans that committed voter fraud in an effort to vote for the Republican side or in opposition to Joe Biden, which I found to be very ironic, considering that that was the party that backed these claims, that backed President Trump in these claims of election fraud. But the Americans are turning on these audits. The American public is turning on this big lie. They're making this something that seems to be very clearly an effort that is deemed partisan. That the big lie is something that they do not approve of, and it might actually impact their electoral performance in 2022. Because what I see from this is that Americans are upset that we are still talking about the 2020 election nearly a year later. 4 months, a year ago, in 4 months, we would have been talking about the election. Go back a year ago, add 4 months, so 8 months ago. I didn't mean to put it that way, but I guess they got a little bit stumbled over my words there. But you're talking about an election that occurred nearly a year ago, and yet we still find a way to bring up the possibility of election fraud, and we have these audits that ultimately find nothing. And that's why it's being viewed of so negatively, because all of this for everything that we knew on November 7th, 2020. So thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe on the left. Please follow on Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server. Holy crap, I just got completely derailed there. I have a set script here. I don't read anything, but I have it memorized. Forget about this end screen. But on the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for, let's go ahead and throw in the Biden-Harris analysis videos. We haven't done that in a while. But again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.